What's up everyone, my name is MarkHawk and today we're doing a quick side-by-side with Sony's AS100V against the GoPro Hero4 Black Edition. Now we're going to put these cameras through a variety of tests, so use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most curious about, or sit back for a few seconds and we'll start playing them all. So, let's get out there. Alright, so as we get started, the Sony HDR-AS100V is running its latest firmware, which is 2.0. The Hero4 Black is running its post-launch firmware, which is 1.02. And what 1.02 did was basically increase clarity in some of the lower resolutions, such as 2.7K, which we'll kind of cover in a little bit here. Both cameras are basically recording in their high bitrate mode. Now with the Hero4 Black, that's Pro Tune mode, and with the Sony HDR-AS100V, that's its Pro mode, which is also referred to, I believe, XAVC. Basically what this does is it allows more information writing to the memory card, which results in better results. So if we're looking at the Hero4 Black, take a look at the grass at the bottom of the screen. It's super sharp, and so is the AS100V. But when we zoom into it 200% here, you'll notice the Hero4 Black does have an advantage, especially at 4K. The Hero4 Black at 4K just has an amazing amount of clarity and depth of field, all the way up to those mountain lines in the background. Everything is much sharper and less muddy than the AS100V. Now the AS100V isn't far off, but it's not as crisp and clear. Now we got into the debate earlier this year whether or not vivid mode being enabled gave us contrast, basically increased sharpness on the HDR series. In my opinion, when you do have neutral or vivid color mode on, it's not really going to affect the image clarity. It will crunch the blacks a little bit, and it will make things seem sharper, but it's just basically less information as certain edges come against other edges. So again, if we're going to zoom in 100% here, we'll take a look at the ridgeline, for example. The Hero4 Black in its GoPro color mode, we have that contrast there, and we just saw it on the AS100, but it's not making a huge difference for the AS100. It still looks kind of as soft as it did before. Switching between vivid and neutral mode in terms of clarity isn't doing a whole lot for us. As we switch back to vivid color mode, let's say we want to film at 2.7K on the Hero4 Black. Maybe we can't film at 4K because our computer can't handle it, or we just don't have the space to handle that type of footage. The results, especially post-launch, are better with the 2.7K, but we are going to lose a little bit of that clarity that we had with the 4K. The easiest spot to see this is with the grass at the bottom. Again, it's not as muddy as the AS100V, but we've lost some of that clarity in the Hero4 Black. The further we go away from the camera, such as the ridgeline, it doesn't feel as impactful, but definitely just like those little details that are close to the camera, you can definitely feel it. Now we switch both cameras over to their flat color mode, and we're just going to take a look at how these two cameras compare when we have this nice sort of rich red car. Now the AS100V is going to have a slightly warmer tint, and that's very noticeable right there when we switch over and we see just how red the car gets. You can also notice some rock details on the upper right. Just because we're crunching the values a little more, we're seeing those shadows and stuff like that, and it might be more appealing to you. That information isn't being lost there in the Hero4 Black, but it is something later on that we would have to go in and sort of mess with color values. Now if we zoom in here, take a look at the tire and the underwell of the tire. Again, Hero4 Black is doing a really good job with keeping that information, that detail. We can see all the tire treads and all the text on the tire. A lot of that gets lost on the AS100V, but as we look out into the distance, you know, the tree lines and stuff like that, they're not as noticeably different between the two cameras. And if you're looking at the whites in the sky, like the clouds, you'll notice in the AS100V, our whites are very white, but with the Hero4 Black, everything sort of has a mild red tint in the white value. So let's take a quick look at our field of view. Now with the Sony HDR-AS100V, we get a lot of distortion as we get towards the left and right side of the screen. The Sony HDR is much wider by default, but with the Hero4 Black we can enable Super View, which will basically use parts of the sensor that we normally don't see, and it crunches them into a 16:9 image. So as we swap back to non-Super View, you can kind of see just the changes we're making. My car gets a little more squished, the circular wheel becomes more of an oval, but again, it's adding a lot of distortion to our image. Now with the Sony HDR, we don't really have a super view because technically at all times we're using a much wider field of view. However, there's a lot of distortion the further away you get from the center of the screen. Think of the center of the screen as a line, and then it just sort of bevels out the further you go out. So one of the ways we can avoid seeing a lot of distortion is by switching the Sony camera over to its medium field of view. Now the only way to do that is to enable steady shot. And what steady shot is going to do is it's going to use its built-in accelerometer, and it's going to track the motion and counteract it to keep the plate nice and stable. Now this isn't going to help a lot with high frequency jitters, such as if you're going downhill on a mountain bike and the camera's attached to the bike. But let's say you have the camera attached to your body. Now your body's absorbing a lot of those high frequency motions, and it's going to basically at that point only counteract your body's motion. And you can see as we're running through the woods here, it's kind of stable, but as we do make sort of bigger motions, you're going to see the sort of picture jolt left and jolt right, and this is kind of off-putting, but if you're doing these smooth moves and pans and stuff like that, it definitely makes the footage more rewatchable. Now with the Hero4 Black, we can switch between 3 field of views whenever we want. We can go from wide to medium to narrow, but there is no stabilization built into the Hero4 Black or into GoPro Studio. This isn't a mode I suggest filming the whole day in because you are cropping off a lot of information, and you'll also notice a fair bit of distortion in the upper left and the upper right and basically all the corners as the camera is sort of warping the footage in those areas to try and make everything stable and make your subject basically stay in the center. Again, if we have those big jerky movements, you're going to notice those sort of warping effects much stronger in those corners, but if you're not really looking for it, you're not going to notice it. So we're going to switch over to the underwater mode now, and it's a little difficult to compare because if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know the Sony series is still shipping with this sort of default bubble lens, and it's kind of notorious with giving us very poor results underwater. Everything's very blurry and murky, and just it looks very poor. Now with the Hero 4, and ever since the Hero 3 series, they've shipped with a flat lens, which gives us these nice crisp results. And the only real downside to the Hero series underwater is that we don't really have the color control that we need to flood the camera with a little more red to balance out the colors. The Sony HDR-AS100 series actually does film with an underwater scene mode. Now this is actually on top of our neutral and vivid color mode. You could choose between an underwater scene and a normal scene, and then you could choose between a vivid color mode and a neutral color mode. You notice the colors on the AS100 are much more balanced out. It's not super teal, because we're in a kind of teal environment here. It's much more balanced, and it's much more appealing to your eye, but since everything's all blurry, most of this footage is basically unusable. Now with the Hero4 Black, we could throw on a magenta filter for underwater and get, you know, the sort of the same results, and they'd be much more usable and stuff like that, but it's just a little disappointing that Sony's still shipping without a flat lens. Now here we're going to jump into some blue water, and we're basically going to have the same results. You'll notice with the Hero4 Black, everything's nice and crisp. Our colors are a little out there, but at the end of the day, the Hero4 Black's results are more usable. The AS100 is just kind of blurry. If you take a look at that blue tile line in the back, when we switch over here to the Hero4 Black, you'll just notice that instantly you can see all those lines, and there's a large amount of clarity between flat lens and a bubble lens. Now the HDR-AS100B actually does have a flat lens that you can buy afterwards for about $50. It's the MPK AS3, and that's what we're filming with here on the right. And you can see instantly much sharper. Look at those tiles, we can see all the individual lines. I'm in front of the camera and you'll see sort of no change in white balance. And we keep the same sort of color results because we're flooding it with red. Now when we jump here with the Hero4 Black, you're going to notice that the white balance changes to try and compensate my sort of bright blue shirt. And yeah, it's just doing its thing, but it's a kind of a shame that you have to buy the flat lens case. But if you plan on doing a lot of diving, it's kind of a must-have. So if you've been looking at picking up the Hero4 Black, one of its main selling points is its new A9 processor. It's a super fast processor, and basically what it allows you to do, it allows you to film at higher frames per second at higher resolutions. Now with the GoPro Hero4 Black, we can start at 1080p and go up to 120 frames per second, or we can go up to 2.7K and film at 60 frames per second. Now there's a bunch of in-between modes, such as 1440p at 80 frames a second, And what that's going to allow us to do is we can basically, in post-production, using something like GoPro Studio, is slow back our footage. So something filmed at 120 frames per second, we can slow that down to 25%, and when it plays back at 30 frames a second, it's going to be 4 times as slow as when we originally shot it. And we could do all of that at 1080p. Now with the Sony HDR-AS100V, we can achieve 120 frames per second as well, but it's going to be at 720p, and we're not going to be able to use our sort of high bitrate mode. So you can kind of see right here the differences between that, and then we'll kind of slow it down. But in the past, the Sony HDR series had an issue with recording sound while you were in these higher frame per second mode. And if you film it in a way where you do all of the work in post-production, such as where we film it and we film at 120 frames per second, and then we come home later and tell that footage to slow down to 25%, you'll keep that sound. But if you want all the work to be done for you, such as like film it and it comes out in slow motion when you put it on your computer, in that scenario, you're going to lose the sound. So this next section is going to be our audio test. Both cameras are not in cases, and I think the results are going to speak for themselves. Again, thanks to my buddy Gavork for playing his acoustic guitar for us, and again, both cameras are not in cases. So the AS100V has a huge dynamic range of just audio it's picking up. It sounds great in sort of low frequencies and high frequencies, while the Hero4 Black just has a very muffled and mono sound in comparison. And when you listen to each of those by their own, they both sound fine, but when you put them side by side, the AS100V just sounds spectacular. Here we're looking really quick at our contrast test, and this is basically to show you what it'll look like when you're filming in dark areas with bright areas behind it. So just kind of imagine you're going through tree lines when you're snowboarding, you're going out of dark, but then there's snow right outside the trees. You kind of get an idea on how it's going to bloom out those values and stuff like that, and just how your camera's going to need to adjust going in between those two modes. These are actually really good results. I mainly show this because back in the day with the Hero 2, it would just either crunch everything down too much or blow everything out too much. But when we kind of go into a scene here where the sun's starting to set and stuff like that, both cameras sort of even out really well in the low light situation. I think the Hero4 Black does a really good job, especially in these sort of just sun setting moments, of retaining those nice rich blacks. The HDR-AS100V is kind of washing everything out a little, and this will eventually work to its benefit as we get fully into night. But when we're dealing with a lot of low light stuff, I really like how it has those nice rich blacks, but it's not really like killing all of the information. And when we're looking at this building, for example, like the white lights on the building I think look spectacular. I like how the roof is kind of dark and not super washed out like the AS100V. Now that's something we can fix in post very easily later, because technically we have the information there, we could darken it up. With the Hero4 Black, it would be a little harder to go the opposite way, where if we wanted to lighten up that roof, it would be slightly tough. But it's basically a color profile preference. It's nothing's wrong or right. I just like how rich and saturated the colors are in low light mode. It usually lines up with my preference. At this point, the sun is fully set. We're basically at night. And the Sony HDR series has always excelled at filming at night. It's one of the few cameras that I have consistent good results with. Now you'll notice with the Hero 4 Black, our image is becoming very grainy, and this is because the camera's trying to compensate not receiving enough light and basically boosting up the gain. With the Sony HDR-AS100V, it's actually using a back illuminated sensor, which helps get away from having to bump up the grain as much. Now you will still notice it's in there, but it's definitely not as off-putting as the Hero 4 Black. With the Hero 4 Black, there are a few settings that we can change though to try and get better results. So we start off with our Pro Tune setting in our GoPro color grade, and we're going to keep the ISO at 6400, and that's basically telling the camera, hey, boost up the grain as much as you want to make the image sort of acceptable, and that's what we're seeing here. Now what we've done is we've turned Pro Tune off because Pro Tune will actually disable the built-in degrainer in your GoPro camera. Now I was actually expecting the results to look similar to the AS100 when I did this, but it's not really getting rid of the grain like I thought it would. But what it is doing is it's keeping a lot of that sharpness and clarity, because as we lose that grain, if we're using the built-in degrainer, it's going to basically soften our image to get rid of that grain. Now what I've done is I've enabled our flat color mode, and it makes everything brighter, but it also makes all of that grain so much more apparent. So what we're going to do is we're going to lower the ISO, because the ISO again is controlling our levels of grain. So we're going to level that down to 1600, and we're kind of getting similar results now with the HDR-AS100, but there's still that large amount of grain. And you'll notice as we lower the ISO, since we're not telling every pixel to sort of brighten up, we're just making it darker. And as we go down to 400, we're going to remove a lot of that grain, but we're also going to remove a lot of that sort of clarity and noticeability in what we're looking at. And again, with the AS100V, we've kept it at that neutral color mode, just because in my personal preference, that's always been the better results. If we turn it to vivid, it would get kind of dark again. But we haven't had to change any of the settings throughout any of this to kind of keep that nice, consistent result. However, if we were taking photos at night, the Hero 4 Black has a huge advantage because it actually has controls that allow you to keep the aperture open longer. You can change the ISO again, you can change the white balance and stuff like that. The HDR-AS100V doesn't have any of that, and to top it off, its button is in the back and takes the photo immediately when you press it. So it kind of pushes the camera forward and shakes it a little bit, and then when you remove your finger, it's already taking the photo and it's added some motion blur. But if we have the remote and we're taking photos during the day, both of these cameras are actually fairly comparable. I do feel the overall experience with the Hero 4 Black in taking photos is better, but that's not to say the Sony AS100V's quality is really anywhere off-putting. The only big difference is Sony's photos are going to be taken in a 16:9 format, and the Hero 4 3s are going to be taken at a 4:3. And it's important to note that if you're filming in time-lapse mode, the Hero 4 Black will actually give you high quality photos like we have when we're taking individual photos, while the Sony HDR-AS100V will actually crop it down to movie format, so like 1920x1080, and it's very poor results. So if you're filming time lapse with the AS100V, it's good to keep in mind because you might not get the results you're expecting. Anyway guys, if you made it this far into the video and I've helped you a bit, press that like, subscribe, or share button. If I've helped you out a lot, you can consider dropping me a donation or a tip to help me buy more cameras to cover. And speaking of coverage, this isn't the only camera coverage or even accessory coverage we're doing this holiday season. There is a bunch there in these links on the left side here. And if you guys need additional information such as firmware, maybe links, high-res links to these photos, check it out in the information section below. And if you don't see it there, feel free to leave me a question in the comments. It's probably the fastest way I'll get back to you, or you can shoot me an email at markhawkcam@gmail.com. Anyway guys, thanks again for the support, and I'll see you out there.